Laura, can you tell us where your life was at, what you were doing when you first heard about the Peace Camp?
Oh, when I first heard about the Peace Camp, I was in college, and it was an article in the New York Times. It was on page 3, and I remember it vividly because it made a huge impression on me that summer. That was the summer after my first year in college, and I was also canvassing for a citizen action group, and one of the things that happened when I was canvassing in Connecticut, in suburban Connecticut, is I ran into somebody who'd been at Peace Camp that summer. And so she wanted to tell me all about it. Like, I wanted to talk to her about utilities and consumer action, and she wanted to talk to me about Peace Camp. And then the next time I heard about Peace Camp was the next fall, when one of my professors, who I adored, had been at Peace Camp that summer, and she came and talked to the Women's Center, where I was a member, about her experience at Peace Camp, and I wrote an article about it for my student newspaper. And I was totally impressed and totally intrigued, and I remember that first summer thinking that I wished I could be there. But I don't know why it was utterly beyond me to imagine that I could go. But I think it was 2 summers after that before I did go.
Do you remember anything about the article that you saw in the New York Times?
The New York Times article? Yeah, it had a picture of women going over the fence, and there was yarn, and there was all this stuff about the kinds of anti-nuclear activism that women were doing there. And that it was a women-only camp, and it was actually a very positive article. When you think about the New York Times, it was much more positive than you might expect. And I remember talking to my mother and my mother's friends about it. I think I heard about Greenham Common in that article. I remember really understanding about Greenham Common the next fall when I was talking to my professor, Jean Grossholtz, who talked a lot about Greenham, and Greenham as the inspiration for Seneca.
Was the idea of nuclear war something that you thought about in those days? Was it abstract? Was it real for you?
Oh, I think like a lot of kids who grew up in the late 70s, early 80s. You know, I was born in 1964. Nuclear war was incredibly tangible to me, and a very live fear, and something that kids I knew talked about at school. And it was... And the specific questions that came up around Peace Camp, issues that were relevant at Greenham Common and at Women's Encampment in upstate New York, were about cruise missiles. That wasn't so relevant to me. But, you know, Reagan getting elected, I remember just being terrified that night that we would be in a nuclear war in the not too distant future. So yeah, it was very concrete to me. And because I lived in Connecticut, the nuclear subs and the protests down in Groton had been part of the backdrop of things I knew about, not anything I'd participated in at that point.
Can you give us some of your impressions on getting to the Peace Camp?
I'm trying to remember how I got to the Peace Camp, because it wouldn't have been an easy decision to not work in the summer because I needed the money. I think I had some kind of grant that enabled me to go and still make the money I needed to make over the summer. So it was a hard decision, and one I thought about for a long time. Well, I think Jean was still involved in the Peace Camp, and we had organized a Peace Camp at our college. We had set one up in the middle of a green at our college my sophomore year, so that would have been the 83, 84. And we had a group, Women for Peace, and we had done a January term class that Jean organized on the women's peace movement. And so we'd been reading and talking and thinking and planning activism around it for a long time. And so I think all my contact with Peace Camp was indirect. I think it was all through Jean. And she didn't go that summer. But somehow I found the funding, and I must have driven out. Because, I had an old beater car, and thank God it made it. Yeah.
And so you arrived, do you know the time of year?
Yeah, it would have been the beginning of the summer. So, say school got out about mid-June. I would have gotten there around mid-June. And there was a July 4th action. I remember I got there ahead of that. And I had to buy a tent. That was part of what I was trying to organize money for. I got there, and you remember there was the parking lot over on one side, and then I remember, like, pretty much right away, I met, it might have even been you, Hershey. And there was an orientation like that night, and I remember setting up my tent. And so I know I'd seen pictures, and so I had a pretty vivid picture of like tents in a field. But I also think I remember when I got there thinking, my God, it's a farmhouse and it's totally desolate and there's nobody here. And like, where are the hordes and hordes of women that I came looking for? They came a couple weeks later. It was okay. But about that time, a lot of people were arriving steadily, and so things were moving really smoothly. Like, there was orientation, there were work groups, organized into sort of morning work groups right away. It was really an easy time to come.
I can still see you in your bib overalls.
Oh God, I forgot I had bib overalls. What I remember about my wardrobe in those days was that there were way too many like Oxford cloth shirts. Like, I had just wandered in from preppy Connecticut, where I had been sort of trying so hard to, fit in, right?
Tell us a little bit about what the day was like.
The food was all vegan at that point. There were a lot of salads. It was incredibly uneven because, as people were being sort of cycled through work groups, they were being cycled through the kitchen. And some people, of course, were terrific cooks, and some people were really not. I remember eating a lot of things I had never eaten before. I remember miso. That was new to me then. And a lot of salads with a lot of things. I remember one night somebody thought we should all eat flowers. I remember a salad topped with, there were rose petals in it and all of that. A lot of interesting salad dressings. Impressive. Do
you remember any specific actions that you took part in?
There was a 6 minutes to midnight action, and that was huge, and that was exciting. I remember there was a police and buses. I think I did support for that action. I don't remember going over the fence, which surprises me in retrospect, because that wouldn't by any stretch of the imagination be my first civil disobedience action, or the first time I was doing peace activism, because I'd been doing that a lot in college. Not a lot, but it wasn't new to me. But for some reason I don't remember going over the fence. And that summer there was a lot of small groups of people going over the fence and coming back, and sort of learning a lot about how weak the security was at the base, and making a point of proving that. A lot of fence cutting that summer. It's so frightening to think about it now. Can you imagine after the kinds of hyper security around after 9/11? Can you imagine breaking into a base just routinely? It'd be exciting if it happened.
Did you do in and out kinds of actions?
I didn't. I can't imagine why. It seems to me like that's the exact sort of thing that would have appealed to me then, but no. I was very excited that other people were.
So what did you do while you were there?
I have no idea. I remember the writer's circle. That was powerful and important to me. I fell in love. I remember one thing I do remember that continues to matter in the context of debates about gay marriage is all the discussions about non-monogamy and how sort of foundational the kinds of sanity around relationship were to us. It makes me continue to be really clear that this LGBT marriage thing is a really different kind of politics than what we embodied then, what we cared about. I do remember doing speaking gigs. I do remember trying to organize work groups. There was a period by midsummer when a lot of people's enthusiasm for sort of maintaining the land had waned, and the excitement about having a lot of people come and a lot of actions was past, and a lot of people had left, and then there were just a handful of us who were doing the maintaining stuff work, and Mike and I sort of. This is how Mike and I got involved. Mike and I trying to organize people again into, like, let's maintain the work around here. Let's make sure the bills are getting paid and the speaking gigs are getting done and the land is being maintained. And so we were like, we're just going to have work group meetings every morning, even if only the two of us show up. And, we did that for, 3 days. And then, we disappeared into a tent for another 2 weeks. Like, we gave it up too. I'm trying to remember if the writing group was ever where you guys workshopped songs for Average Dyke Band, or if that was separate. I think that was separate. But I remember being incredibly moved by the kinds of stories and writing that women were sharing about their lives and their struggles, and feeling like this was a way that people were finding a voice and finding a way to share stories about their lives. I learned an incredible amount, I was not only just 20 years old, but coming from families and communities where people didn't talk about much. And so, while certainly we knew lots of people in our community who were sexual abuse survivors or living with alcoholic parents or abusing substances, or all the struggles that people go through in their families and in their communities, there was so little language to talk about it. And that impressed me, that sense that we were going to build community out of our best attempts at wholeness and our best attempts at truth. The other thing I remember a lot from Peace Camp is the music, that we were always singing, that you all were, with the Average Dyke Band, put together some powerful songs about that, about our experience, about trying to tell the story of our politics, trying to tell the story of our lives. And if we weren't always good at the infrastructure, and I realize now maybe that was the thing that I was most focused on, was trying to figure out, and it's so funny because it's so much like what I do now, trying to make sure that all the pieces were going to get put together, that we had the money and the food and the land was okay and everything was going to be fine, but that for so many people it was about writing and art and music, and that contributed so richly and deeply to what we learned about who we were together, what the world we wanted to have was. That was the best of us in a lot of ways. Well, the practices were, of course, the most interesting part, but there was also a lot of talking. It was such a lesbian event, right? I mean, we had as much conversation as we had sex. And the conversation about sex was all very interesting. But what I remember us talking about is trying to understand the nature of relationships and how to create non-exclusive and egalitarian relationships. And that, I mean, a real sort of, a real exploration of, do we become more fully ourselves when we don't have, one exclusive partner? And our questions of jealousy and attachment, are they really not part of the world that we want to build? And it's funny because when I read about bohemian and leftist communities from the 1920s throughout the 20th century, it's a conversation that comes up again and again and again. And it's so interesting to me that our dominant practice is to couple off into monogamous couples. But every time we open up the world of what do we really want, who do we want to be, we immediately start pulling apart the monogamous couple. And I think that's fascinating, and that's probably why I have so little investment in the politics of gay marriage. I mean, in individual people's lives, I honor the relationships that they have with each other, that they celebrate through these commitments, these ceremonies. And I even this summer in California, when it was legal, performed a wedding for somebody, performed a marriage. I had gone to divinity school. I never got ordained. But in California, you can get deputized as a marriage commissioner. So I wrote the ceremony and I married a couple, and it was very moving to me, and we all wound up crying. I mean, it was just intense. We were lost. But so I don't mean to minimize the power of that, or even pretend like it hasn't been important to me to have been there in that park in San Diego performing a wedding for somebody. And in my own life, for the last 20 years, I've been in monogamous couples. It's certainly easier. And non-monogamy takes a ton of time. There's the sex, that takes a lot of time. Actually honoring the sexuality between you and someone else all the time. But also just the talking. The talking takes a ton of time. But I don't know that it's my sort of most cherished hope for how we can be a community, how we can be in relationship to each other. It's just something I get too tired to do differently. And I don't mean to minimize that I have loved the relationships I've been in, and that they've been really rich and rewarding, and I've grown from them a lot. But boy, non-monogamy is interesting. I mean, lesbian communities all over the States, I think at that point, were talking about non-monogamy, and I lived in or near Northampton in those years, which was a lesbian center. So if this was 1985, I would have been out for about 2 years, and in one relationship for all that time. And so I'm sure I didn't get involved with Mike without a lot of talking, maybe on the phone with my girlfriend then. And for a while, I don't even know if I can explain this except to the two of you, but it's such a different time and place. But for a while, Mike and I were experimenting with a rule that, because we didn't want to be exclusive, that between times that we slept with each other, we had to sleep with someone else each in between each time, which gives you a sense of like how many people were passing through and how easy it was to hook up with somebody, not in an uncaring way, but for a night. That just seemed like, of course that was possible. Like, can I imagine that now?
What were some of the things that you got at the peace camp that you carried into the next stages of your life?
I wonder if I can even do that question justice, because, on the one hand, that was such a formative time in my life, the way it would be, or the way it is for anybody to be 20, 21, 22. But it also seems like so much of what I learned and who I became at Peace Camp were really important and continue to inform me. Like, one of the key things is I think that we don't do things alone. People who emerge as, we were always very egalitarian and very anti-leader. I think I would, in my own life, have a more complicated conversation, a more complicated discourse about leadership now than I did then. But the thing I understand very clearly as, like, now being the head of a department and involved in all sorts of stuff on campus, is that we do things in communities. We build things in communities. If we need to make decisions in communities. Nobody makes good decisions by themselves, and because the politics of things matter, because they really matter, and we learn from listening to each other. I've continued to be involved in all kinds of different activism over the years. And it's never much mattered to me to be the person out front. And that's something I learned at Peace Camp. That's more about how we do things together, how we build a movement, how we build communities, how we build politics, how we make change. That happens together. Well, I learned that there are no single issues, that our politics have to be interconnected, or at any rate, my politics are interconnected. I was at a conference at which heads of women's studies departments were talking about our departments, what kinds of things we teach and do. And somebody out of the blue sort of decided to get into it with me about whether women were at the center of everything I thought and did. And I was talking about teaching a book about neoliberalism and how economic change in the last 2 decades has sort of screwed everybody. And she's like, I don't see how women are at the center of that. And the point was almost incomprehensible to me. To me, to be doing politics around women's lives is to be involved in every kind of politics. It's to make questions of disability central. We got into a huge thing in my department about how we were getting moved into a building that wasn't accessible. And I was, adamant that we had to find an effective way to make sure that didn't happen. And at various points, people said, is this our issue? And I was like, how is this not our issue? And the one concrete example I had to point to at that moment of the people our department couldn't leave behind was a male student of mine who used a wheelchair. So is this our issue? Of course this is our issue. We move together. We move together or we're not moving. So it's hard to recreate the moment of the terror and the craziness of the Reagan years and of the Cold War and of the nuclear threat. But it's not, and in 1989, when it seemed like that threat receded, certainly I gave us a lot of credit, the peace movements especially the peace movement in the Soviet Union, but the peace movements across Europe and the United States, in in bringing down those regimes. Sadly, more effectively in the Soviet Union than in the United States. But the idea that, but there have been many critical issues since then, right? When we were at Peace Camp, what did we know? What were we thinking about HIV/AIDS? And that became so central, at least in my life and my communities, for so many years after that. It's so, those years and those ways of thinking about politics as interconnected, thinking about leadership as something that we do together, thinking about, and we would have mocked this then, but thinking about politics as something we figure out in meetings. We went to so many meetings, but we learned stuff by listening to each other and by listening to the reality of our lives. And so I've never stopped being active. And I keep thinking that, you know, at different stages, as I move into different arenas. I mean, I'm now a tenured professor. Like, how scary is that? I would not have imagined that when I was at Peace Camp. And my fear would have been that if I had become a tenured professor, that then I would have, you know, life would be too easy. It would be too easy to sell out my politics. And the funny thing and the weird thing is, the more I move into positions of, you know, power and authority and respectability, the more consistently radical my politics it's become. But I also think because it was so central to us to live everything with integrity, that issue of integrity has also remained central to me. Like, you know, you don't get to pick and choose your politics, you don't get to pick and choose your issues, and you sure don't get to pick and choose the opportunities and the moments when you have to do something. And I think that, in my experience, makes me different from a lot of people I know who may feel strongly about things, but may feel less of an imperative when they see something happening, that they have to do something, like whether it fits in their life right then or not. Yes, there was especially the 1987 March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, which I remember as really different from the 1993 March. 1987 was really sort of us and our politics. It felt like us. I remember the demands included an end to apartheid in South Africa, an end to the wars in Central America, and the fights over whether we were going to whether you had to include the anti-racism statement on every piece of fundraising, and a conflict with Southern California because Southern California didn't want to include the anti-racism statement, and then Southern California ripping up this really big check right there at the national meeting. And Michelle Crone was active in that. Also, a number of people that I met in Boston. It was at the first national meeting of the civil disobedience groups that I first met the guys from ACT UP, which I had never heard of. And they had this cool, you know, pink triangle, silence equals death logo. And it was brand new. They were like passing it around, look what we made. And we're like, big deal. So, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. I remember talking to them about civil disobedience. I remember being in a workshop with Michelle Crone and me and these guys from ACT UP and some other people from feminist movements and from peace movements, feminist peace movements. And they were, the guys were just riveted by what we were telling them about civil disobedience and direct action, and really feeling like that moment played a role. I mean, there are a lot of stories about how ACT UP came to civil disobedience, and they're all true, I'm sure. But that was one of the moments, one of the currents feeding that fed how ACT UP came to do civil disobedience. It was such a funny moment. It stays in my memory as a moment of sort of passing the torch. At that moment, I was writing for Gay Community News, and it was such a difference in my life from doing organizing only with women, and Gay Community News being the first time I was working with a lot of men. And I came to really appreciate it. I think if the AIDS crisis hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been able to see those communities in their full humanity if I hadn't first seen them in their suffering. But I think we had all, or many of us by then, had come to a point like that. And so there was such a generous sense of sharing the lessons of the women's health movement and the women's peace movement with these guys from ACT UP who it seemed like knew nothing about politics, were like born yesterday, and were sort of privileged and obnoxious, and trying to school them in a whole history of movements and politics and how to think about things.
Did you have the support of your family in the work that you do politically, being at the Peace Encampment, non-monogamy?
Those were not good times between me and my family. My family was not at all happy about me coming out, and not at all happy about the civil disobedience and being in trouble with the law. That was appalling and scary to them. My father, it's hard to remember this, my father was a Reagan Republican, and so we were absolutely at odds. And my mother was and remains, a liberal in this sort of mushy way. And so anything that looked radical to her in those days seemed very scary. But it was okay. We had a community at Peace Camp, and there was a sense that, and this continued through the 80s, because after Peace Camp, the next major political movement that I was involved in was Central America Solidarity. And this sense that we were in the streets and that we took our politics seriously, that we cared about each other and we cared about the world and the future of the world. I was sad to lose touch with my family, but at that stage in my life, just sort of happy to launch a different trajectory that seemed life-giving and affirmative, and like just the next thing we needed to be doing. It so wasn't a question whether to live my politics or not. Once I figured out how to do it, figured out how to get in the streets and with whom, it was all over. Yeah, that was going to be central to my life. I didn't really get close to my family again until actually when I lived in the Dominican Republic for a year. And that was an interesting time. That was 1992, and I'd gone to the DR partly because I wanted to learn Spanish, partly because my partner was an anthropology graduate student, and so she had to go somewhere and do something. But also because I'd been working on AIDS money for a long time, and that was in 1992 really shifting to the right wing. So there was no more AIDS money to live off of. I couldn't get, small-time grant writing jobs, small-time writing publications kind of jobs. And so whatever, pick up and go. But that was a really interesting time. It was the first time I lived outside the U.S. And I was profoundly struck by a few things. One of them was the importance of education to communities, that writers and scholars and teachers are not incidental. Sometimes we're really anti-intellectual in the United States. Sometimes we don't. And sometimes we don't value the work that scholars and intellectuals do, and that universities do. Universities at that point really shifted in my mind from being sort of part of the establishment to someplace where you could productively do political work, because that's what they had been in Latin America. In Latin America, the 1968 movements all emerged out of universities. The other thing that changed for me was seeing how important families were to people. They were important to people's survival in a material sense, but they were critical to people's survival in an emotional sense. And I was moved by that. And people, you know, met millions of people, and, you know, they always had two questions, you know. Are you married? And because I wasn't out, however successful that move was, I would just sort of labor through the no, I wasn't married, and thanks, that was really okay with me. But also, especially as I got to know people, their first question for me would always be, how's your mother? And of neighbors and friends. And eventually this forced me to actually start calling my mother on a regular basis, because that sense of family connection being so fundamental. And that was actually a real gift, to learn how to relate to my family, who on the one hand are so similar to me. We had so many experiences in common across 18 years, and then but on the other hand being so different.
Were you at some point doing some union organizing?
Oh yeah, that's what I moved to Boston to do. I did organizing among nursing home and hospital workers. That was really interesting. Multilingual communities, almost all women, and hardworking folks, mostly immigrants, struggling with the possibilities of organizing. I don't think I understood at all then what it meant to be trying to organize among Haitian and Latin American workers in the 80s, to understand at all what they'd fled from and why. Union organizing would have been both so exciting and so frightening to them. I understand that a lot better now. Spent a lot of time in Central America since then, talking to people in communities about what those years were like. The books that I've written and worked on, you know, they're about different subjects. They're about reproduction and sexuality in Puerto Rico and the question of imperialism. And these days I'm writing about children. It's funny that you remember me with Jasmine on my lap. And now I've raised a foster child and all that. But that's funny, I just realized something. I always say that I have a junk drawer brain, and I drive academics crazy because, you know, they want to know, what are you working on? And they want me to tell one story, right? I'm writing about U.S. foreign policy or something. And I'll say, no, I'm writing about a question of U.S. imperialism and colonialism, and in relationship to questions of adoption, in relationship to questions of economy, in relationship to problems of violence and war and militarism, and the question of family and how we experience domesticity and put together relationships. And this drives people bats. I mean, and it's hard to write too. I don't want to pretend this is like a good way to organize books, but it's such a peace camp sensibility. Right? I mean, everything I just said that's important to me now was important to us at Peace Camp. And that's where the organization of it comes from. All those images we had of webs and everything being interconnected. Yeah, that's still how I write books. Or that has become how I write books.
Touch one string and pull them all.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's even a metaphor. Oh my God, I hadn't thought about that. It's even a metaphor that I use to talk about the problem of organizing a book like this. Trying to find the thread that you can pull all the way through is what I always say. It never crossed my mind where that metaphor might have come from, but still. No, I remember lots of stuff about about healing and about ritual and about herbs. I remember doing fire walks that both those summers probably, and being involved in ritual groups, in covens, and we continued that when Mike and I moved to Boston. She formed a coven there, and I remember we would continue to do lots of rituals in lots of places like the ocean and all of that. That was powerful, that was intense. That's funny how I've come to inhabit what looks like such a conventional life in some ways. I've become a member of a church, an upstanding member of a church. I preach. I've been on the vestry. I've done the whole thing. And there's no way I could have gotten there except through leaving church, through the experience of Wiccan spirituality that we enacted, that I learned so much about at Peace Camp. And it asked me to be much more thoughtful and mindful about questions of spiritual journey. It seems to me that the only way you can live in a church in this moment is, to understand the tradition that you have to work against, and you have to understand but you also have to understand the life of the Spirit that very much exceeds anything that could happen in a church. And to try to sort of gather in all that spiritual energy and bring it into a church, and political energy. I mean, that's what I really love about churches, is that they're such terrific places to organize people different from you.
Do you remember much about the firewalks?
Oh, they're etched in my mind. The firewalk I remember best is the first one I attended, because it was not a culty thing that I had heard a lot about at that point. The whole idea was new to me. And so I remember gathering a circle of women. I remember calling the four directions. I remember calling ancestors, and other people we wanted to bring into the circle. And I remember just the sheer wild magic of it, the sense of unleashing something among us and in the world. And it blew me away to walk on hot embers and not burn my feet, and watching other people do it. I remember, Hershey, you were at that first firewalk I was at. And probably you were too, Estelle. It was such a Peace Camp moment. I mean, the sense that we could only get there together. That what we were saying was, what will make this work is if there's no fear in this circle. It was intense. Once you'd done it, it was addictive. I remember that the first time walking across, like what you said, both believing and not believing at the same time, that you could walk across it and not get burned. I don't even remember it feeling warm. Yeah. I remember only the sound of the embers sort of being crushed under my feet, and finding that very strange, that the sound was so detached from any feeling in my feet, and really feeling like we were transformed. We had transformed the material world. We had transformed ourselves through what we had done in that circle. And it was wild. It was thrilling. I remembered one thing. You asked why I wasn't going over the fence that summer. And I did finally remember that while Helen had felt fairly confident that it was something that you could do and maybe not do jail time, we had started the conversation. Many people were feeling like we were smaller in number, and that they were going to start cracking down on us. And I had really wrestled in the year before, being part of a civil disobedience group, and knowing a lot of people who did plowshares actions, and really wrestling with whether to take that step of doing a plowshares action and possibly going to jail for a long time. And really being talked out of it by an older nun, saying, who just somehow gave me, not permission, but almost sort of took the authority to say, this is not the time in your life to do that. This is the time in my life. And she was probably in her 50s or 60s. This is an appropriate choice for me to make. It's not an appropriate choice for you to make. And so by the time I got to peace camp and folks were talking about possibly doing real jail time, I had decided that that wasn't what I was going to do with that part of my life. That if I wasn't willing to face the possibility of going to jail for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and I wasn't, then there was no sense in sort of playing with the risks of it. That I wanted to do something I could do and feel sort of a sense of integrity and clarity about. And so doing support for those kinds of actions, that I could do. And being at peace camp, that I could certainly do.